وللنفس بتقواها.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان. صدق الله العلي العظيم. In the name of Allah, the All-Beneficent, the All-Merciful. The month of Ramadan is one in which the Quran was sent down as guidance to mankind with manifest proofs of guidance in the criterion. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 185. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam. We would like to welcome you all to our 2025 Shahr Ramadan program at the Islamic Center of America, hosted by the United Network of Islam. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with another opportunity in seeking closest to Him in the holy month of Ramadan. May Allah accept and reward all your efforts and worships in these blessed days and nights, inshallah. Before we get started with tonight's program, we would like to recite some verses from the Holy Quran. Please help me welcome Brother Ibrahim Ajame to the stage after three loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allah.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. ثانية على حب الزهراء صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا إنا خلقنا الإنسان من نطفة أمشاج نبتليه فجعلناه سميعا بصيرا إنا هديناه السبيل إما شاكرا وإما كفورا إنا أعتدنا للكافرين سلاسل وأغلالا وسعيرا إن الأبرار يشربون من كأس كان مزاجها كافورا عينا يشرب بها عباد الله عينا يشرب بها عباد الله يفجرونها تفجيرا يوفون بالنذر ويخافون يوما يوما كان شره مستطيرا ويطعمون الطعام على حبه مسكينا ويتيما وأسيرا إنما نطعمكم لوجه الله لا نريد منكم جزاء ولا شكورا إنا نخاف من ربنا يوما عبوسا قمطريرا فوقاهم الله شر ذلك اليوم ولقاهم نضرة وسرورا وجزاهم بما صبروا جنة وحريرا متكئين فيها على الأرائك لا يرون فيها شمسا ولا زمهريرا ودانية عليهم ظلالها وذللت قطوفها تذليلا صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
Thank you, Brother Ibrahim, for that beautiful recitation. If we can give him another loud salawat. So just a couple announcements before we get started with tonight's program, inshallah. So if the brothers and sisters can please move up in front, there's a lot of open spaces in the front, so we can keep some open seats in the back for the people walking in later. Thank you. And there's question QR codes. There are papers around the hall that have QR codes for the Q&A after the program. If you would like to submit a question, please scan, and it will direct you to a link to submit your question. Alhamdulillah, through the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the efforts of the sisters and brothers of the UNI, we have made an initiative to truly dedicate our efforts in reviving the Medina bookstore in hopes that we can sincerely give proper Islamic education about our beliefs from our grand respected scholars of the modern era that have truly done great work for the sake of Allah and Islam. The Medina bookstore will be open every night during and after the program in the month of Ramadan. If you have any questions, please see me or one of the organizers after the program, inshallah. In the holy month of Ramadan, we are taking sponsors each night to help us with our UNI programming, bookstore, and so much more. In our traditions, we usually always donate on behalf of our deceased. General nightly donations are set to $100 per night and $300 to sponsor a suhoor with a scholar event. If you'd like to sponsor a night, please see me or one of the organizers at the front table after the program, inshallah. Tonight's donation is more of a general donation on behalf of Bishafa al-Maradana wa Rahmat al-Mautana wa Qada al-Hawa'ij of all the Muslimin and Muslimat and Shuhada. Please recite Surah Al-Fatiha بعد الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين صدق الله العلي العظيم. Thank you. Make sure to keep up with the UNI on Instagram. That's at UNIORG_. Again, that's at UNIORG_ for weekly programs and events throughout the year. For those who don't have social media, please see me or one of the organizers after the program so we can put you in our WhatsApp announcements chat where all details will be shared there also, inshallah. So without further ado, please help me welcome my sincere friend, mentor, and brother, Samahat Sheikh Ahmad Cherri, بعد 3 loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. صلي على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. I begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. May the peace and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon His final messenger Muhammad and his blessed and purified progeny. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers, dear sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Before we continue our discussion, which the subject of which was divine love and the means of attaining that love, and the divisions that we went through in acquiring knowledge and how knowledge precedes faith and how faith is love and knowledge precedes love and so on. After every session we have a Q&A. And naturally, because the questions are coming immediately, and sometimes while I'm answering a question, we are receiving questions in real time, I noticed that a lot of the questions went unanswered. So I thought that it would be beneficial to address the unanswered questions first, so that nobody leaves these sessions, inshallah, with their questions unanswered. Bidnillah ta'ala, we'll try to the best of our ability, inshallah, to cover all the questions, of course the relevant questions, inshallah they're all relevant. And so I've gathered them, and we have about, 25 questions that were unanswered in the past few nights. And questions are relevant because they are indicative of the state of our community and our society. And when somebody puts the effort to ask a question, especially on a public forum, they might be speaking something that is on the minds of many. So inshallah, hopefully, we'll address these questions and they can help us gain some benefit, inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So the first question that we have here on the list is, as inheritors of the prophets, should Muslims be knowledgeable about the Bible and the Old Testament? We mentioned that the Muslims are inheritors of the prophets. The first and the primary inheritors are the Imams, alayhum salam. Now, it's important to understand where one is living. One, to be aware of the times and the land that they are in. And so, as individuals who live in the West, it's important that we understand the Christian experience in order to navigate the world and the society that we are in. For those who either learn about this experience from traveling abroad, for example, when you travel to Europe, you'll realize that a lot of the issues that we have over here, our societies are different than European societies. Our society differs from England in and of itself. And you'll find that certain societies have certain issues and certain characteristics that distinguish it from others. For example, you'll find that in England, but the vast majority of atheists come from England. And one should ponder and ask, why is that the case? That the prominent atheist thinkers and speakers in the world come from that area and come from that land. It's a very valid question. And so when you make that comparison and you look at Europe and the United States, you'll find that we are very much a Christian nation. We're a nation that believes in God, or at least a God-believing nation. But the vast majority of it being a Christian nation. True that the polls now indicate that Christianity is on a decline in America. How is that relevant to us as Muslims? Because we have to navigate the society that we live in. We don't live on a rock or under a rock. We live with people around us. We have to interact with the society that's around us. We have a role to play, and it can affect us in different ways. Even when it comes to policy, for example, when it comes to Zionism and the history of Zionism, for example, how can we understand it without the correct understanding of history and the Western experience? And considering that we live in a globalized world where our problems are no longer just our problems, and considering that our country is a country that influences the rest of the world, we find that the issues that we face, even on a social level, are faced by our brothers and sisters in the East as well. We import certain challenges and we export certain challenges to the rest of the world, and we also import certain challenges. For example, the whole issue about gender and identity and LGBTQ plus and so on. When this first came about and it became an issue here in the US, and specifically in Michigan, when we had protests and discussions with regards to books and so on, and the alarm was raised, I remember having a gathering in my home in Qum and with some of the Western scholars and mentioning to them that this issue actually was addressed in Europe in 1994. Policy legislation was put in place from 1994 to remove pronouns, to change the school system, and so on. And so there's 30 years, at the very least, 31 years of data that we can sift through, of arguments for and against that we can sift through to know what are the consequences of adopting this legislation and that legislation. Why? Because you want to be able to talk to people in a universal language, the language of the intellect, right? You want the other person to be able not just to understand. You can't go up to them and tell them my scripture doesn't allow me to. You have to give them a intellectual or reasonable argumentation for why you're against what you're against. And so there's plenty of data for individuals who want to go and learn and research, because there are parties in Europe for and against. And we find that certain political parties in the US, for example, are trying to bring these issues to the forefront. They're trying to make America, in a sense, more European. But the question when it comes to, for example, the issue of gender and women and so on, even the women's rights movement, a lot of us adopt certain cases in certain causes without understanding the context, and we consider them universal. For example, the issue of women's rights. If we study the West and we study, for example, the Christian perspective on sexuality, we'll understand why we live in an overly sexualized society. We will not understand why these phenomena exist around us, why everything is sexualized, such that a child is not given the opportunity to experience being a child, while everything is directed towards the desires. If we truly want to understand that, see, critiquing is easy. The more important question is why? Why is the society this way? Are people just born rotten? Are they born bad? Are they just born with the inclination to indulge in their desires to the utmost degree? Don't they have an intellect? Doesn't their intellect tell them that there is a virtue in restraining, self-restraint, and discipline? Why do they go against that? When we study the relationship of the church and the position of the church when it comes to sexuality, for example, and the effects that it had on Europe and the sexual revolution that took place, we'll understand why the subject is on the forefront. the subject has attained some sort of sacredness in the Western mindset. As people that live in the West, we have to understand the land that we live in, the history of this land, the history of thought, the history of the philosophies that exist, and the effect and shape and form people's perspectives, their worldviews, and their opinions. So yes, there's an obligation on every single Muslim to understand the time that they live in, the land that they live in, to better navigate these challenges. They have to understand what modernism is. They have to understand what postmodernism is. These concepts are very, very relevant to the struggles that we face every single day. So does that mean we have to refer to the Bible and the Old Testament? To the extent that we require. Perhaps the questioner was asking, do we need an intense review of the arguments in the Bible and the Old Testament as Muslims? Well, Islam, first of all, we have the position that these books are books that were changed. But as followers of the madhab of the school of the Ahlul Bayt, there is a certain criteria that can help us easily navigate the validity or lack of validity of the religious truth claims within these two books. One is how they deal with prophets, let alone the divinity of Christ and so on, which is self-evident, the arguments against them, etc. Rather, how they deal with prophets in the first place. The insults that are in the erroneous acts that are attributed to prophets. For example, a prophet who, if we have time, we're going to go over one of the narrations from Imam al-Qadim alayhi salam talking to Hisham about Nabi Dawood alayhi salam. Nabi Dawood, in the Christian and the Jewish context, is said to have sent a man to war so that he could die, so that he could marry that man's wife. This is how these prophets are dealt with in these texts, let alone other vile things that are attributed to prophets, like lying, like incest, like all kinds of vile acts attributed to the prophets of God. That treatment of the prophets of God alone should deter an individual from following such faiths or believing in such truth claims. Because if that truth and these laws that these prophets came to spread didn't help them become a better human being, then how are they going to help you and me? The proof is in the pudding. And that's why Isma is something that we hold strong to, we hold fast and hold dear to. That every prophet of God was infallible in action and infallible in knowledge. And if that infallibility is not found in those texts, then we know there is something deeply wrong with how these prophets are being revealed to the general public, or how they're dealt with in these texts, for example. Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli as well mentions something very important, which is that the Imam alayhi salam, he said in one of his lectures, Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli is one of our prominent maraja. He's a mufassir of the Quran. If any of you know Arabic or know Persian, I recommend that you go over his tafsir al-Quran. Many of the volumes are being translated into Arabic, and he's a student of Allama al-Tabatabai, the one who wrote Tafsir al-Mizan. He says that the Imam, Ajjallah Ta'ala Farajhu Sharif, when he arrives, will not be roaming between the shrine of Sayyid al-Masuma alayhi salam in Masjid Jamkaran. For those of you who have been to Iran on ziyarah, there's Masjid Jamkaran and there's the shrine of Sayyid al-Masuma. They're all in one city. He says that in our minds, we consider that when the Imam alayhi salam returns, that he'll just be in our lands, in our areas. A true follower of the Imam has a universal perspective. And this kind of relates to what we were talking about yesterday, about the openness of Islam, the inclusiveness of Islam, the universalism of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam. In that the Imam alayhi salam requires individuals in all parts of the world, The Imam is concerned with every single individual that walks on this earth. The Imam requires individuals in Germany, it requires individuals in Australia, requires individuals in Europe, requires individuals in China, in Japan. So an individual to be effective for the Imam, they have to be aware of what the thought and what influences the thought and the philosophies of these lands. So he requires people of thought, people of broad knowledge. So it's important that we understand the philosophies that shaped these societies. We have to read, if, for example, we're in Europe or in Germany, Kant and Heidegger and so on. So that's something to keep in mind, that all of us who have a wish to walk in the footsteps of the Imam, to be soldiers of the Imam of our time, alayhi salam, have to have a broader perspective. We can be of greater service based on the level of knowledge that we have. Second question. What should one do if they feel like God is constantly sending trials to them and bala, while most of their du'as for good things are not being answered? Trials and tribulations can come about from the sins that we commit. That's one interpretation that exists. Is that when one commits a sin, out of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divine mercy, He puts us through certain struggles in order either to awaken or for Him to forgive our sins. Such that even the pebble that you find in your shoe that causes you distress as you walk is there out of forgiveness for one of your sins. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to give you any form of hardship in order to see how you will endure, in order to forgive that sin. And by the way, sometimes we look at sins, as soon as the word sin comes about, grand things come to our mind. Anger, listening to music, and so on. A sin could be that you frowned at your mother, that you frowned at your father, that somebody asked for help and that you turned them down, that you broke the heart of an individual, that you used a harsh tone on an individual when speaking and interacting with an individual. A sin doesn't have to be something major. It could be something that we're unaware of. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us that bala in order to forgive that sin. Or it could be in order to raise our status. Now when we look at the dua literature and the hadith literature, we're called upon to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to push away bala, to push away trial and tribulation. Although it is something that is a means of our ascendance towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're called upon pleading God to not make it a means for our ascendance, but rather to take us up there Himself without that bala. Another thing it could be is that we've set a certain standard with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us good, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us bounty, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts our prayers, we lose something greater. We lose sincerity. Our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deteriorates. We're no longer aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because the need is no longer there. Remember the dua of Imam Ali alayhi salam in Masjid al-Kufa during the nights of Shahr Ramadan. How he describes himself as the beggar and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the provider. And we talked about one's innate poverty. And we said that if you don't feel a need for religion, you don't feel a need to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will not be able to establish that connection with Him. And this is one of the conditions of Hubbullah Azza wa Jal, by the way. Recognizing that something is a virtue in the first place. Recognizing that connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides me with something good, is in my best interest. In fact, I need it. I need that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes wealth, sometimes a full stomach will distract us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that Shahr Ramadan comes to re-emphasize that. That when one is in a state of hunger, one is more aware. Why? Because the hunger keeps you present. If your stomach was full, your mind can drift off and think about other things. But when you're constantly aware of that hunger, you're constantly aware that you're in a state of fasting. And why are you fasting? You're fasting for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That hunger then becomes a reminder of God. So it keeps you God wary throughout the day. So if your stomach was full, would you still have that reminder? Would hunger be a reminder of God? No, it wouldn't. You would be busy thinking of other things, thinking of other ways to spend your time and spend your life and enjoy your time and so on. Friends that you want to hang out with, things that you want to do. But the hunger keeps you grounded. So how do we get out of that? By maintaining that presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout. So, such that my relationship with God isn't a relationship where I only remember Him when I need Him. I recognize that I need Him regardless of whether my dua is answered or not answered. I need Him regardless of whether my stomach is full or my stomach isn't full. I need Him regardless of whether my bank account is in the positive or in the negative. I need Him regardless if I'm married or unmarried. It's not a relationship of a merchant where I only go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when I need something. Rather, that presence of God is a constant. How do I achieve that? Through awareness. How do you achieve it? Through pondering, through contemplation. You use your aql, your intellect, in the words of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, to combat your desires. You recognize the certain traits within yourself. Self-observation is necessary. Muraqaba, muhasaba. Every night you observe yourself. Okay, well, I entered in a state of heedlessness and a state of ghafla. This is how I am. Why? Because something came about, because of an app on my phone, because of an interaction with a certain individual. So I have to minimize my interactions with that individual. So I have to remove that app from my phone. If I find myself weak in performing certain acts individually, then I have to surround myself with better people. And if I find myself stronger performing certain acts collectively, like salah for example, if I find that jama'ah is much easier for me, which it should be in theory, then I strive to pray salat al-jama'ah. I strive to do dua in jama'ah. I start to make slight adjustments in my life according to my own soul and according to my own temperament. While most of their du'as for good things, or my du'as for good things, are not being accepted, but not answered in the sense that you're not given what you seek immediately. We have a narration that mentions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the servant does dua and their voice reaches the heavens, that there are some whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the angels and orders them and commands them to give what they seek immediately. He says, give them what they seek and what they ask for I hate to hear their voice. Give them what they want and let them be off. And there are others where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the angels to withhold. And He says, I love hearing their voice. I love hearing their plea. We mentioned the Diwan of Layla al-Majnoon. There's another verse of poetry that exemplifies how the lover of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at trial and tribulation. Majnoon says of Layla, if Layla did not love me, then why did she break my plate and my plate alone? She chose amongst all these individuals to break my plate, to get my attention. And so he views even that trial and tribulation from the point of love, as a message from the Beloved, a glance from the Beloved. We see this as well, this theme, in the poetry of Rumi as well, in which he says, even if it be an insult, then keep your eye on me. That, oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it be in praise or it be an insult, be it praise or condemnation, be it praise meaning a bounty or a blessing, or it be in punishment, I am satisfied so long as your eye is on me. We see this as well in Dua Kumail, in the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam, in which he says, even if I can bear the fires of hellfire, how can I bear being away from you? Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the real trial, the real Jahannam, the real punishment, the real pain is not in these fires that surround me, not in this trial, not in this tribulation, rather it's in my separation from you. And I will call out to you. And so this is another perspective that one can take when it comes to bala. The best thing that you can do is ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to push away that bala, change your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you show rida, first and foremost, satisfaction for everything that you are given, and you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the good and the bad. For the bad, yes. If something bad happens to you, do sajд al-shukr. Thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thank Him for the good and for the bad, for everything that you have been blessed with and given. In another narration, we're told that the two narrations that are similar, and one was mentioned in an earlier night, which is the moment that God forgives you is the moment of regret within your heart. If you sense that regret, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is there. Another narration mentions, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The narration escapes my memory, inshallah. If I remember it, I'll mention it. The third question. Some people are easily able to connect with God, or they were raised with it more. Others struggle more, especially with the desire to practice Islam. How is this not rigged, in a sense? What can be done? Well, this is not just with regards to Islam. Some people are born tall, some people are born short, some people are born wealthy, some people are born poor, some people are born in war-torn countries, some people are born in countries with stability. This external, quote-unquote, inequality is visible, whether it's with regards to religiosity or not. That's not the criteria. The criteria is in that what we consider is that we all have equal opportunity. These things are there, and they're there in a certain way for every single one of us in a very different manner. Some are born with greater opportunity to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the sense that they're born in a religious community, they're born with access to certain material, they're born with the Arabic language, they're able to access certain things. But God doesn't ask for those things in specific per se. He asks for your heart. He asks for sincerity. He asks for your efforts. You are punished and rewarded based upon your capacity. So if you have less opportunity, you can still apply that which you know. Work within your own capacity. Try to expand your capacity through gaining knowledge. The reward that you have is much greater. In a narration which I roughly remember, when one of the companions, I believe, asked about an individual who is a Muslim and a practicing Muslim in an area where he's a minority, where the society around him is non-Muslim, and they try to practice and they die in that land, he says they die as a nation. That individual is given the reward of a nation because it's more severe, it's more difficult. So we have equal opportunity in order to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we shouldn't look at our circumstances and let our circumstances determine my relationship with God. We can't make excuses for ourselves. We all are given the same amount of time, and we have to take advantage of that time and divide that time in the wisest of ways. And instead of lessons can I take and can I derive from my circumstances and my scenario in order to move ahead and in order to help others. The fourth question, research scientists here. I deal with pigs, monkeys, and mice to test new therapies. What should I keep in mind as a Muslim? That question should be directed to your marja taqleed. There are research scientists all over the world, even in the Islamic world. There are criteria for things you can do and can't do and things you should look out for. Inshallah, may God give you tawfiq. 5. Is any level of confidence in oneself or ego halal in Islam? By the way, this subject is one of the reasons why people don't like spirituality. Well, the Eastern form of spirituality, whether it's Islamic or non-Islamic. Well, what concerns us is the Islamic aspect of it. But even in other Eastern religions, the concept is there. in that the emphasis in Islamic spirituality is on fighting against the self, on dissolving the ego. Western spirituality reinforces the ego, reinforces pleasure. Yoga, which is supposed to be a sacred act amongst the Hindus that involves certain practices and the theme of which is nirvana, they call, which is equal to fana, annihilation of the ego, has become to make you feel good, to make you feel happy, to give you a better sense of peace. So it increases your self-worship. You begin to worship yourself. It's a perversion of a sacred act. And so this kind of deters individuals from Eastern forms, the true Eastern forms of spirituality, which center around dissolving the ego. I don't know what you mean by halal. We hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us tawfiq to dissolve and annihilate our ego completely, whether in this world or inshallah in the hereafter. So no, self-confidence is one thing, is to know where you come from, where you are, and where you're going. But the ego has no place in the heart of somebody who's a muwahhid, who believes in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is only one in your heart. There's only one. There cannot be me and God. God is and only is, and no one else is but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. La ilaha illallah. There can't be I am and God is. There's still an issue with the tawheed from that level and from that aspect. But this is gradual, meaning you got to take it easy on yourself. It's not something that you jump to. It's something that you spend your entire life trying to get to that point. Your salah assists you, your fasting assists you. Everything falls in line in order to assist you in combating yourself and dissolving your ego. 6, how can one deal with obsession/paranoia about najasa? This is a common question, and I've received it since the beginning of Shahr Ramadan at least 4 to 6 times. First of all, is to understand that your criteria is God's criteria. Yani what you're looking for is the hukm al-shar'i. Nothing more, nothing less. The hukm, what does it say? The law, the legal principle, what does it say? It says that if you don't have certainty in the najasa of a thing, it is pure. That is the point of departure. That's the basis for everything. And that is what should be governing your actions. So you shouldn't try to be holier than the Pope. You shouldn't be trying to go around cleaning the bathroom and think that you did a good thing. Because doubt, it comes from a place, doubt belongs to the shaitan. It comes from a place of uncertainty. And this uncertainty, in comparison to yaqeen, is related to the shaitan. Yaqeen is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The more you practice disciplining your soul on relying on doubt and acting upon doubt, you're only torturing and tormenting yourself. We are creatures of habit, brothers and sisters. We are called upon to build good habits, positive habits. So you are training and disciplining your soul to develop a behavioral problem. Eventually, if you can't, through your own intellect, overcome this obsession over tahara and najasa, you have to see a therapist and tell them, I have OCD, and they have to find various means in order to allow you to build new habits. But that's a fact. There are some individuals where as much as you talk to them, you can't help them. The bottom line is, you have to seek help at the end of the day and tell them that I have a problem. I have an obsessive compulsive disorder where no matter how many times I tell myself reality is one thing, I don't believe the reality that's in front of me. I'm in some sense delusional when it comes to this aspect of life. And so I have to change that. And so you have to seek professional help at that point. If you cannot, through understanding, overcome it on your own, such that the hukm al-shar'i, the legal law, at one point becomes that you have to abandon the laws of tahara and najasa in order to overcome that illness. That for you as an individual, you should no longer pay attention to tahara and najasa if it gets to the most extreme of points. And Imam Salih alayhi salam says that the individual who acts based upon shak has in reality worshipped the shaitan. They know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying one thing, and they ask that, and he says, ask that individual, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? They'll say, the hukum is this. He says, then what do you act upon? He says, I act upon my doubt. Where does your doubt come from? He says, waswasa, the shaitan. So you are obeying the shaitan. You are practicing obedience to the shaitan in that paranoia over that najasa. So you either get over it with your intellect, or you seek the help that you require. I'm trying to skip through some of them because time is getting short. 9. Is it our duty to bring up religious obligations or knowledge to friends and family, even if it may be annoying for them to hear? This is Amr al-Ma'ruf wa Nahy al-Munkar. This is important, by the way. This is very important. Because, and I was just talking to Sheikh Abdul Rahman yesterday about the subject, the hardest part of being in the position that we're in is that, for example, we have the ICA, which is a open door for everybody to enter and try to find nearness and to reconnect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for those of you who go to various centers, you know that the crowds differ from center to center. Now in the ICA, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, we are able to bring in a different crowd. For example, you might not know it, but amongst you, perhaps today, I can't tell from every single face, but in the previous nights, we've had Christians in attendance and we've had Sunnis in attendance amongst us today. This is one of the unique things related to the ICA. We have individuals who are influencers who don't wear the hijab, for example. We have individuals that are influencers that don't salli, but they're trying to reconnect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they come to this place of worship, trying to establish that relationship with God. And the most difficult thing for me, as somebody in this position, is to receive questions saying, well, why are the brothers and sisters mixing in the mosque? Why is the hijab this way? Why are there these interactions and so on? At the end of the day, you try organizing 800 people, 1,000 people, 600 people, 300 people, and getting everybody to act in a certain way, first and foremost. It's not something practical. It's not something realistic. You can't. You can't. People wish they can. They wish they can. Even when you go to stadiums and you go to soccer games and football games and so on, they can't organize or control large amounts of people. But people say, well, at least you should give a gentle or subtle reminder. First and foremost, when it comes to gentle and subtle reminders, yes, a gentle and subtle reminder is necessary. But the criteria here is gentle and subtle. It requires a certain level of wisdom. What puts off people from religiosity is none other than the behavior of religious individuals, the judgmental nature of religious individuals. If you're very picky and you're very judgmental, that person is going to go to other crowds and see people who don't practice your faith and find them more accepting, more understanding. At least they're willing to have a conversation. They don't make them feel like a horrible person. So it's about how you go about conveying that message. Being smart about it. It's not stepping back from your principle. It's not making the haram halal. It's saying that, no, this is how I am, this is what I believe, but you don't say it in a way that puts down the other person. Sometimes doing amr ma'ruf wa nahy al munkar can cause you harm. In this case, or you know that it's not going to give a result. In this case, you're not called upon to do amr ma'ruf wa nahy al munkar. It's going to cause you harm. You have a certain level of certainty that this is going to happen. No, you're not in a position or in a place to put yourself in a place of harm or a place of discomfort. You can try to say things in a gentle way. You're not responsible per se for how people perceive your advice, so long as you put the utmost effort to say it in a kind and gentle way. Some people, no matter how you say it to them, they're going to be upset. But it's important to speak the truth. And it's a great sacrifice, and it requires a lot of courage. We shouldn't back down from our principles, from what we know to be valid and to be true. But we have to ponder why we believe and can understand it. And so it takes a certain level of creativity. It takes a certain level of wisdom, and it takes a certain level of akhlaq, knowing the ethics, morality, how you can interact with the other individual without causing harm, without making them feel down, without making them feel like they don't have a place. So how we behave, even in our Islamic centers, when we see things that we might not like or we consider ugly, because sin is ugly in nature, and that can put you off. We have to deal with it from a place of compassion, from a place of love. And we understand this on an individual level, growing up, that we wish, for example, that certain lessons were taught to us in life, either by family or in school or so on, through gentleness, through compassion, through love. That could be, was mentioned in today's lecture, this was that day. How can one attain such a state and allow him/herself to let go of worry and be a positive contributor through his/her confidence and trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How can you attain certainty? The Holy Quran responds and it says, وَاعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيكَ الْيَقِينَ, and worship your Lord until certainty comes to you. It's through worship, through worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, how does worship relate to certainty? It's related to the earlier discussion on acquired and experiential knowledge. That worship that leads to that ma'rifah, the understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, gives you yaqeen. Now this verse has been interpreted in various means. Say yaqeen, certainty, is reached through death, the experience of death, and on the day of judgment where everything will be revealed, everybody's certainty will be equal. See, the book Al-Kafi, the book of Hadith, the first chapter is called the book of intellect and ignorance. Al-Aql wal-Jahl. They say, why is it called Al-Aql wal-Jahl? Why is it not called Al-Ilm wal-Jahl, for example? Knowledge and ignorance. Knowledge is the opposite of ignorance. The intellect isn't the opposite of ignorance. They say because the intellect is the criteria for punishment and reward. Knowledge will be equal, certainty will be equal on the day of judgment. But people will not be equal. They will be judged and rewarded on the basis of their intellect. And so we have to strive through gaining knowledge, through our worship. One of the best forms of worship is talabul ilm, gaining knowledge, attaining that ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the correct means, to the words of the Ahlul Bayt. Read the hadith of the soldiers of Aql and the soldiers of Jahl, inshallah. This is taking up, 10 questions is taking up all the time. I'm not going to take longer than this. So inshallah, perhaps tomorrow we'll continue the next 10. If that is something that you guys think is beneficial, inshallah, let us know in the Q&A. When you're submitting a question for the Q&A, let us know if you would like us to return to the original subject, or you can be patient for tomorrow that we can address the next 10 questions, inshallah. Or I'll leave it to lecture, for example, number 10 or number 11. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.